But now Iluvatar sat and hearkened, and for a great while it seemed good to him, for in the music there were no flaws. But as the theme progressed, it came into the heart of Melkor to interweave matters of his own imagining that were not in accord with the theme of Iluvatar, for he sought therein to increase the power and glory of the part assigned to himself. To Melkor among the Ainur had been given the greatest gifts of power and knowledge, and he had a share in all the gifts of his brethren. He had gone often alone into the void places, seeking the imperishable flame, for desire grew hot within him to bring into being things of his own, and it seemed to him that Iluvatar took no thought for the void, and he was impatient of its emptiness. Yet he found not the fire, for it is with Iluvatar. But being alone, he had begun to conceive thoughts of his own, unlike those of his brethren. Some of these thoughts he now wove into his music, and straightway discord arose about him, and many that sang nigh him grew despondent, and their thought was disturbed, and their music faltered. But some began to attune their music to his, rather than to the thought which they had at first. Then the discord of Melkor spread ever wider, and the melodies which had been heard before foundered in a sea of turbulent sound. But Iluvatar sat and hearkened, until it seemed that about his throne there was a raging storm, as of dark waters, that made war one upon another in an endless wrath that would not be assuaged. Then Iluvatar arose, and the Ainur perceived that he smiled, and he lifted up his left hand, and a new theme began amid the storm, like and yet unlike to the former theme, and it gathered power and had new beauty. But the discord of Melkor rose up in uproar and contended with it, and again there was a war of sound more violent than before, until many of the Ainur were dismayed and sang no longer, and Melkor had the mastery. Then again Iluvatar rose, and the Ainur perceived that his countenance was stern, and he lifted up his right hand, and behold, a third theme grew amid the confusion, and it was unlike the others. For it seemed at first soft and sweet, a mere rippling of gentle sounds and delicate melodies. But it could not be quenched, and it took to itself power and profundity. And it seemed at last that there were two musics progressing at one time before the seat of Iluvatar, and they were utterly at variance. The one was deep and wide and beautiful, but slow and blended with an immeasurable sorrow, from which its beauty chiefly came. The other had now achieved a unity of its own, but it was loud and vain and endlessly repeated, and it had little harmony, but rather a clamorous unison as of many trumpets braying upon a few notes. And it essayed to drown the other music by the violence of its voice, but it seemed that its most triumphant notes were taken by the other and woven into its own solemn pattern. In the midst of this strife, whereat the halls of Iluvatar shook, and a tremor ran out into the silences yet unmoved, Iluvatar arose a third time, and his face was terrible to behold. Then he raised up both his hands, and in one chord, deeper than the abyss, higher than the firmament, piercing as the light of the eye of Iluvatar, the music ceased. Welcome, I'm Professor Rachel Fulton Brown, and this is The Forge of Tolkien. I'm recording now, as I've been telling you in the last several episodes, on January 20th, 2021, and therefore this theme that I proposed today seemed to me to be, again, topical. Where does evil come from? I mean, this is clearly a great theme of Tolkien's work throughout. If you know The Lord of the Rings, of course, we have Sauron, and we'll be getting to him in great detail in The Ring. But we're still at creation, and we're still with the long meditation that we had last time on the music, and music as the method of creation that Iluvatar is using through the voices of the Ainur, to raise up themselves in harmony. And you could say, well, okay, so we want a creation which is all beautiful and all harmonious and all the great singing that the angels bring before the throne of the Lord. But there's another kind of music that plays against that harmonious sound, and it's the one driven by Melkor, right? It's this discord. Is discord a bad thing? Now, that Tolkien's setting us up to be wondering about that in this moment where Melkor is desiring something, and he's clearly Satan, right? He's clearly a satanic character, in that Melkor, whose name means he who arises in might, is of the Ainur the firstborn, the greatest. To Melkor among the Ainur had begun the greatest gifts of power and knowledge, and he had a share in all the gifts of his brethren. So Melkor, while the other Ainur have a variety of gifts and can sing in according to the instruments that they've been given, Melkor is like Lucifer among the angelic hosts, or so we often talk about it in the Christian mythology, that he is given the greatest beauty, the most gifts, the most desire for knowledge and power. It's interesting he's given power and knowledge, but not love, right? Because we are playing with this problem of the angels, and technically, if he was among the highest angels, the cherubim and the seraphim, he'd also have the burning of love for God. He's given power and the desire for power and knowledge, and this desire for the imperishable flame, and his desire grew hot within him to bring into being things of his own. That Tolkien gives in this creation moment. Tolkien gives Melkor the desire to create himself, to bring into being things of his own. So again, why is this necessarily a bad thing? I mean, it's interesting that although if you know the story in the long run, Melkor is going to become Morgoth, who's going to become the Ainur, who's Sauron is actually servant to. It's not clear at the outset exactly what his wrong is, right? It's like he desire grew hot within him to bring into being things of his own, and it seemed to him that Iluvatar took no thought for the void, and he was impatient of its emptiness. Yet he found not the fire, for it is with Iluvatar. So here we have this longing that Melkor has to create, to make things. And surely we've been talking all along about the way in which we as human beings are made in the image and likeness of God, and therefore should it's appropriate for us to want to create. It's appropriate for us to long for the beauty of creation, and it's appropriate for us to want to participate in the making of that beauty. Well, here's Melkor, right? Isn't he doing that? He wants to make things, bring them into being of his own desire, and he goes looking for the flame but can't find it because it's only with Iluvatar. And he thinks, I mean, the word here is, of course, very important, in his impatience, that Iluvatar cares not for the void. Now, remember that this void, in fact, it's like, it is and it isn't the problem of evil already, right? It's the fullness of the music that the Ainur are making, that they've, the places of the dwelling of Iluvatar were filled to overflowing, and the music and the echo of the music went out into the void, which is in this story the first mention that we get of that emptiness, that not, right? The emptiness that is not filled with the music, and yet the void, when the music of the Ainur flows out into it, is not void. It's not, in fact, accurate on Melkor's part to think that the void is not affected by the music. But obviously he's starting to be selfish, right? But the first thing that he seems, the first sort of moment of his fall is both interweaving matters of his own imagining that are not in accord with the theme of Iluvatar. So it's discordant, not according, discordant, and that he's impatient. That's an interesting tweak on the fall of the angels, that we're trying to figure out exactly what it was that the angels did. Now, you could say, well, we should just look at the Bible, right? Doesn't the Bible explain to us what happened with the fall of the angels? This is one of those moments where things get instantaneously tricky, right? There's today, as we are, I won't say celebrating, attending to, paying attention to, or vastly ignoring the inauguration of our 46th president of the United States. Much talk of, the ways of the world and the Lord of the world and the dominion that he has over it, the enemy, and exactly what it is that he's able to do and able not to do. And this seems to be this sort of central feature of our Christian faith, that in fact we know what Satan's like, we know where he comes from, we know how he operates, and we know what to look out for. Except if you look at the Bible, it says kind of next to nothing about what happened in heaven before Genesis, right? And you remember last time I started us off, in the previous episode with Music of Creation, showing you that one of the great puzzles in Christianity, or in our storytelling that we do from within the faith, is, although we believe in angels, we believe that they exist as invisible beings and that they're creatures of God and that they have, intelligence and so forth. None of that in detail is in the scriptures, right? We have if you go to this book alone and want to understand what the angel Gabriel was or is, or who the archangel Michael is, you're not going to get a story like Genesis of where they came from or even when they came from. That Genesis simply starts with the first day, and there's this backstory to some of the creatures that are named within the mythology that they're just there, right? And yet we must believe they're creatures because God created everything, right? That's a tricky one. So in last episode, I pointed us to the Book of Jubilees to say, yes, in fact, there are stories that come out of, particularly as we call it, the Second Temple tradition, that tell, which, it's like, if you want to date that more accurately, 530 BC thereabouts to 70 AD. After the Second Temple the first temple is destroyed by the Babylonians, right? And the Second Temple is thereafter built. And the Second Temple period is the one during which, for example, the law develops as we understand it with Deuteronomy. But it's also the period in which we get written down versions of much more of the, I keep saying mythology because I just want to say story world, right? It's because cosmology is part of it, but it's all of the beings that are in fact there, for example, constantly in the book of Psalms, right? So I was reading, I do plan these, and then I think of things as I'm reading. As I was reading the passage from the Analindale just now, I was thinking of ways in which, for example, the Psalms reflect more of this language than, sorry, I've lost it. I don't know what psalm I was thinking. I was thinking when I was reading the passage about what happens before the throne, right? And that that this great chaos that arises around the throne of Iluvatar, and that there's a turbulence, right? This turbulent sound, and Iluvatar sat and hearkened until it seemed that about his throne there was a raging storm as of dark waters, that made war upon one another, in an endless wrath that would not be assuaged. And as I was reading that, I was thinking about there are passages in the Psalms that describe the throne of the Lord and how it's seated upon the waters, right? And I think, again, Tolkien is always going to be thinking through the scriptural language and through the scriptural stories. And if you're worried about whether or not they're Christian, it's like, oh, I'm going to make you feel sinful for reading them. We're going to get to sin and temptation and all of that, definitely. But go read the Psalms and go get in your bones the kind of music that Tolkien would have known. And then a lot of this language that is playing out in his mythology makes a lot more sense, including this image of a Iluvatar with his throne seated upon the waters, right? That the angels are somehow there, and they're somehow doing something around the throne of the Almighty, and their premises about exactly what their relationship is to the All-Father, again, embedded in the scriptural stories. But, curiously enough, what we tend to get in the both the Old Testament and the New Testament is simply assumptions that you already know all of that, because otherwise certain things that the characters in the Old Testament and New Testament say don't make any sense. For example, I'm in the midst of Jesus sending his instructions out to his followers. We get this little moment in Luke chapter 10, and Jesus has told 72 of his disciples to go out and preach in the towns, and telling them, if they don't accept you, just shake the dust off your feet and leave, right? And they come back having gone out on this mission and preached to various people. And the 72 returned with joy, saying, Lord, the devils also are subject to us in thy name. Which, again, it's like, well, what are devils? Where do they come from? Why we don't have in Genesis the story of the creation or the fall of whatever devils are, right? They're just kind of already there. They're just assumed in the story, right? And then Jesus says back to them, and he said to them, I saw Satan like lightning falling from heaven. That's it. Don't you want to know the rest of the story? Don't you want to know where? Who's this Satan character? Where is he coming from? When did Jesus see him falling? Behold, I have given you power to tread upon serpents and scorpions, and upon all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall hurt you. But yet rejoice not in this, that spirits are subject unto you, but rejoice in this, that your names are written in heaven. And then he goes on to completely change topic. Apparently, in that same hour he rejoiced in the Holy Ghost, and said, I confess to thee, O Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because thou hast hidden these things from the wise and the prudent, and hast revealed them to little ones. Yea, Father, for so it hath seemed good in thy sight. All things are delivered to me by my Father, and no one knoweth who the Son is but the Father, and who the Father is but the Son, and to whom the Son will reveal him. And turning to his disciples, he said, Blessed are the eyes that see the things which you see. We want to know more about this Satan falling from heaven, right? We've got an entire poem written by John Milton, Paradise Lost, in which we have there Lucifer described falling down, after the battle that he has against St. Michael in heaven. And so some of it is implied in the book of Revelation, but the book of Revelation seems to be what's going to come in the future, right? Not what's happened in the past. Or is it the past? Who knows what time is? Maybe it's not linear in the Bible. Maybe Genesis and Revelation flipped. Actually, I never thought of that. It is curious that we assume that we know all sorts of things about this story of the fall of Lucifer that simply aren't narrated in any great detail. Not at least in the books that became part of the scriptures. However, are considered canonical. However, there are occasional interesting references to other stories, and the most famous of these, or at least it should be famous, is to a book that some of you may have heard about, attributed to Enoch. Right now, apparently there's some discussion about whether or not in this passage it's actually the Book of Enoch that's being referred to, or a reference found, for example, in other compilations, midrash commentaries of this Book of Enoch. But in the letter of Jude, this is a little short letter, it's just a couple pages in the Bible, in the usual Bibles, there's a reference to a prophecy attributed to Enoch that simply says, actually, I found raging seas, right, in the verse before that. So we have woe being prophesied against the way of Cain. Woe unto them, for they have gone in the way of Cain, and after the error of Balaam, they have for reward poured out themselves, and have perished in the contradiction of Korah. These are spots in their banquets, feasting together without fear, feeding themselves, clouds without water, which are carried about by winds, trees of the autumn, unfruitful, twice dead, plucked up by the roots, raging waves of the seas, foaming out their own confusion, wandering stars, to whom the storm of darkness is reserved forever. Now of these, Enoch also, the seventh from Adam, prophesied, saying, Behold, the Lord cometh with thousands of his saints, to execute judgment upon all, and to reprove all the ungodly for all the works of their ungodliness, whereby they have done ungodly, and of all the hard things which ungodly sinners have spoken against God. Now that passage of itself doesn't seem to be terribly exciting, but that it comes from, or it seems to be a quotation from Book of Enoch, particularly 1 Enoch, which is another of these texts, like the Book of Jubilees, which comes from the Second Temple period, older than the New Testament, and known by the early Christians, obviously, because there's Jude quoting from it, recognized, for example, in the Ethiopian church, but not considered canonical in the churches that most American Christians tend to know about, right? The Orthodox or the Catholic or the Protestant. The Book of Enoch contains lots of stories about angels, right? And I say the Protestants have actually been very, very interested in Enoch. For example, in the 16th century, and the great Elizabethan sorcerer John Dee, who was very, very interested in stories of angels, and very interested, therefore, in the Enochian books. The Book of Enoch, like the Book of Jubilees, gives us more of that backstory to the kinds of imagery that we find throughout the Old Testament. Now, you can say, I was thinking about this from last discussion. Which comes first, right? The time traveling problem all around. Are these things in the Old Testament, because the stories of the angels are much older than the written versions of the scriptures, and therefore I think this is probably what it is. And so the authors of the Old Testament are they're writing within a story world that people already know all the characters, right? And so they're not constantly giving you the backstory of the main figures. You just are dropped in the middle of it, and here we are with angels and demons, and the significant bits that we want to know about our heroes, right? But the story world itself already contains all of these elements, and nobody thought to write them down until Enoch. I mean, the opposite is, you could say, well, this doesn't entirely make sense. It's right. You wrote down all of the stories of the Old Testament, so that includes things like, Satan and Lucifer, possibly, kind of not. Satan's there. We're going to get to that. And the intertestamental books, right? Things like Jubilees and Enoch that are written between the newest prophecies in the Old Testament and the New Testament. Those intertestamental books are written simply to fill in, to fill in the things that the creator, the original writers of the stories never made up. right? You can see it going both ways, right? It's like, think about it, how it worked out in Star Wars, for example. So you have the early movies, the first three movies, and maybe Lucas had the rest of the story in his head, maybe he didn't. He said he did. It's kind of premise there. It's sort of assumed that you have certain kinds of mythological elements, and the fan world writes up the rest of it, right? So it's like filling in all of the backstory on characters that were just there conveniently as story devices. That could be what the authors of Enoch and Jubilees are doing. They're just filling stuff in. It's like Tolkien is, right? He's taking this problem of the existence of beings like the angels, the Ainur, and trying to figure out, well, what makes sense as the story from what we know about how they behave later in the stories. Or the mythological world was all already there, as I've just been saying, and the Old Testament is just written with the assumption that you all already know it. What's delightful about this is you can't solve this problem, because both versions of how those stories come into being are possible, right? And the kinds of proofs that scholars want to use to say absolutely this wasn't known beforehand tend to break down every time when you try to make these sorts of before and after claims, which is why we get into so much trouble as scholars. But with the Book of Enoch, which is interesting, you have a variety of things like the stories of the fallen angels. And many of you are probably, if you're out there in the conspiracy theory world, know about things like the Nephilim and the angels in Genesis, who the sons of men who come down and make wives of the daughters of men and have giants with them. In Enoch, and that's in Genesis 6, right? Aren't you happy that Tolkien wrote up the Ainulindale, and so we know all about who Melkor is? With Genesis 6, all we get is the sons of God, seeing the daughters of men, that they were fair, took to themselves wives of all which they chose. And God said, my spirit shall not remain in man forever, because he is flesh, and his days shall be 120 years. Now giants were upon the earth in those days. For after the sons of God went into the daughters of men, and they brought forth children, these are the mighty men of old, men of renown. And God, seeing that the wickedness of men was great on the earth, and that all the thought of their heart was bent upon evil at all times, it repented him that he had made man on the earth, and being touched inwardly with sorrow of heart, he said, I will destroy man. So there is in Genesis the implication, which is somewhat different from the implication of the fall with Adam and Eve, right? It's because we have Adam and Eve, and we have them cast out of paradise, and we have the great list of begats in Genesis chapter 5 from Adam. Enoch is the seventh. Sorry, how did I have that? It's in Jude, right? Enoch, the seventh from Adam, so he should be there. Adam, Seth, Enos, Canaan, Malaleel, Jared, Enoch, right? So Enoch is the son of Jared and the father of Methuselah. And Enoch walked with God and lived after he begot Methuselah, and all the days of Enoch were 365 years. And he walked with God and was seen no more, because God took him. And that's how we have this. The book of Enoch is talking about what happens to Enoch, the seventh from Adam, after he's taken up into the heavens, and he sees all the angels, and he becomes an angel himself, the Metatron. There's a lot of angel lore that's, like I said, this backstory problem, right? It's there if you start reading the Old Testament and you start really wondering, well, where do these different characters come from? And with the angels, the sons of God who take wives from the daughters of men and have giants, and the giants are great men of old, and God seeing that wickedness. Why? Right? It's like there's so much that's not said about exactly where all the wickedness comes from, because at this point we've had, um, you know, I should have counted them. The generations of Adam over time. After that, men began to multiply upon the earth, and daughters were born to them. Da da da. Where did the wickedness come from? Where does the wickedness come from? And it's so curious, because I think with Tolkien and the Ainulindale, he's also wrestling with this. God created all of these Ainur. They're the holy ones of his thought, and they're singing before him. And Melkor simply desires to participate in creation. You could say that the sons of men in Genesis are doing that too. The sons of God. That the angels in this story, they want children, right? They want and they find the daughters of men, they find women beautiful, and they want to have children with them, and so they beget them. And in Genesis, it's these are the mighty men of old, men of renown. I'm reading the footnote now, which is interesting. The giants, in the Duerim's note, it is likely the generality of men before the flood were of a gigantic stature in comparison with what men now are. But these here is spoken are called giants, as being not only tall in stature, but they're adding something, but violent and savage in their dispositions, and mere monsters of cruelty and lust. Except for they're not, right? They're just mighty men of old, men of renown. So there's that God is going to see the wickedness growing on earth and see Noah, but where does the wickedness come from? There's this real sort of puzzle of what it is, right? What wickedness is. I mean, we know it's going against God, but there's various disjunctures. Well, the book of Enoch explains more that there was a leader of the angels, Samyaza, not an angel name that I'm terrifically familiar with, who says unto 199 other angels, sorry, I'm skipping a bit. Samjaza has convinced the 199 other angels to beget us, to go, and they're the sons of God who are begetting children with the women. And at this point, he says to them, I fear you will not indeed agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty of a great sin. And they all answered him and said, let us all swear an oath and bind ourselves by mutual imprecations not to abandon this plan, but to do this thing. So go get children, like it says in Genesis. Then swear they all together and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it. And they were in all 200, who descended in the days of Jared. Okay, you can go down lots of rabbit holes with this. On the summit of Mount Hermon, and they called it Mount Hermon because they had sworn and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it. And in the book of Enoch, we get more angel names, right? One of the things, there's very few, well, there's like 3, maybe 4. There's only a very few angels actually named in the Bible, but the tradition, particularly the Kabbalah, but some of it's coming out of Enoch here, carries with it all these other angel names, right? And so we have a list of names: Shamyaza, Arakiel, Ramiel, Kokabiel, Tamiel, Ramiel, Daniel, Shazakiel, Barakiel, Asael, Armoros, Batariel, Bezaliel, Anael, Zakiel, Shamziel, Satariel, Turiel, Yomiel, Sariel. You notice how they all end in L? Again, like my name, Rachel, it does. L is God, right? So these are the sons of God. They're all of God, of God, of God, of God, right? And they sleep with the daughters of men, and the daughters of men, and the daughters of men become pregnant, and they bear great giants, whose height was 300 ells. Now we have details about how big these giants are, who consumed all the acquisitions of men, And when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. And they began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, and to devour one another's flesh and drink the blood. Okay, none of that shows up in Genesis, right? It's just like they're giants and they were great. And then there's wickedness. This is a good encapsulation of the problem of what the fallen angels are, because it doesn't say in enough detail, and if you fill it in from Enoch, you're doing this before after problem, right? Was it all known to the author of Genesis and he simply didn't put it in? Or did Enoch, the author of Enoch, see that Genesis had these places that you could fill in stories and add it, right? Well, one of the things that the author of Enoch adds is extremely interesting, right? And that is that the fallen angels, chiefly Azazel, taught men crafts, right? And going back to what Tolkien is doing with Melkor, he's setting him up to want to make things himself, right? That the problem that Melkor is creating with the music is it's interweaving matters that are of his own imagining, not in accord with the theme of Iluvatar, and that he's impatient with Iluvatar because he thinks Iluvatar doesn't, attend enough to the void, and Melkor wants to fill it, right? And so here he is, weaving these thoughts of things that he wants to make into the music, and some who singing alongside him who are singing along despite him grow despondent, and their thought was disturbed and their music faltered. But some others, right, and this is meaning to be, right, these are going to be the Ainur or the Maiar who follow with Melkor, so the fallen angels, right? Some began to attune their music to his rather than to the thought that they had at first. And then his discord spreads. Well, the author of Enoch plays off of this, the desire for creativity that seems to be at the sort of heart of what makes Melkor impatient. But the effects that it has on humanity are very, very interesting in the way Enoch describes it. So, Azazel taught men to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates, and made known to them the metals of the earth and the art of working them, and bracelets and ornaments, and the use of antimony, and the beautifying of the eyelids, and all kinds of costly stones and all coloring tinctures. And there arose much godlessness, and they committed fornication, and they were led astray, and became corrupt in all their ways. Simyazah taught enchantments and root cuttings. Amoros, the resolving of enchantments. Barakiel taught astrology. Kokabel, the constellations. Ezekiel, the knowledge of the clouds. Arakiel, the signs of the earth. Shamsiel, the signs of the sun. And Sariel, the course of the moon. And then in Enoch, Michael, Uriel, Raphael, and Gabriel, the angels that we actually recognize as good angels, appeal to God, judge the inhabitants of the world and the fallen angels, and Uriel is sent by God to tell Noah about what's coming, right? So it's folded in to this story in Genesis, but with a lot more explanation. Again, you could say it's akin to what Tolkien is doing with this. He's trying to make sense of the problems that Christian mythology presents to us, specifically here. Where does Lucifer come from? Where does Satan come from? Why is Satan fallen? And it's interesting that what Enoch gives us as a description of what the fallen angels do is they give men arts and crafts, right? And they give them weaponry, right? Swords, knives, shields, and breastplates, metalworking, but they also give jewelry, ornaments, makeup, right? The beautifying of the eyelids, so it gives eye makeup, gemstones, costly stones, and paint, coloring tinctures, right? So they give Azazel gives humanity, well, the works that, in fact, we'll find out of the Ainur that Ale works in primarily, right? The smithing. That Ale as uh, works with the kinds of materials that, in fact, there's a passage that of the fabric of earth had Ale thought, to whom Iluvatar had given skill and knowledge scarce less than to Melkor, that Ale has similar sort of skills as Melkor does. And with these fallen angels in Enoch, they get, that's where those particular kinds of skills come from. They also get enchantments and root cuttings and the binding and loosing, right? So the kinds of powers that, in fact, Jesus is said to give to his disciples, the binding and loosing of the power to bind and loose, that's spirits, right? So that's one of the gifts that Azazel teaches. Things like astrology, divination, I guess meteorology, knowledge of the clouds, signs of the earth, signs of the sun, course of the moon, all of these sciences, right? That is a kind of complicated claim to say that the reason, it's like, okay, we've got the ancient aliens are here, right? The reason humanity has all of these crafts and skills and knowledge and prognostications and enchantments and so forth is because the fallen angels gave them to humanity, and that is the wickedness that God, gives, sends the flood for, after giving instructions to Noah on how to build an ark, right? So you're kind of, God the maker seems to be in both directions, because of course in Genesis God gives Noah delightfully detailed instructions on how to build an ark, just as he'll give instructions to Moses on making the tabernacle, or to Solomon on making the temple. Making here is clearly this fraught question, right? And it's going to be a fraught question for Tolkien throughout his stories. What did Melkor do that was so wrong, and what did Iluvatar do with it, right? And this is, we're sort of now at the heart of the real testing. Why doesn't Iluvatar just zap Melkor and be done with it? Think in fact what Iluvatar does instead. So here we have the discord of Melkor taking over, spreading ever widening. The melodies which had been heard before foundered in a sea of turbulent sound. And this really vexing me that I can't remember which psalm that is it recalling for me. I could look it up. Take it. I wish I could be doing live streams right now and saying, come on, tell me which psalm it is. I'll go with 92 because I found that one. It's Dominus Regnavit. The Lord hath reigned, and he is clothed with beauty. The Lord is clothed with strength, and hath girded himself. For he hath established the world, which shall not be moved. Thy throne is prepared from of old, thou art from everlasting. The floods have lifted up, O Lord, the floods have lifted up their voices. The floods have lifted up their waves with the noise of many waters. Wonderful are the surges of the sea, wonderful is the Lord on high. Thy testimonies are become exceedingly credible. Holiness becometh thy house, O Lord, unto length of days. You see why I was, when I'm reading, but Iluvatar sat and hearkened until it seemed that about his throne there was a raging storm, as of dark waters, that made war upon one another in an endless wrath that would not be assuaged. That is an image from the Psalms. Now, and remember what I told you last time about the music, right? The music of the Psalms is the music that was sung in the temple. Here we have another extremely important image from not the second temple, the ancient temple, David's temple, Solomon's temple that David wrote the Psalms for, and that this singing, the singing of God that the priests do, one I read to you last time from Chronicles about the way in which the priest musicians sing with all their instruments, and that is what Tolkien is drawing on to describe the Ainur in their singing, right? So the priestly musicians play their cymbals and trumpets and flutes and organs, and we have in Psalm 150, and the list of all of those: trumpet, psaltery, harp, timbrel, and choir, strings and organs, high-sounding cymbals, praise him on cymbals of joy. We have all of that singing, that we have all of that singing imagery. But, and this is, I hope if nothing else, you're going to all go rush off and read the Psalms a lot. That within that, what they're singing about is the Lord enthroned above the waters, right? And in the New Testament, that image of the throne on the waters is there in Revelation, where the throne of the Lamb is seated by the river, right? This is there in Don't You Hate Being Me? You just live as one reference after the other. This is in Revelation in 21:22. That chapter 22, that there's a river of water of life, clear as crystal, proceeding from the throne of God and of the Lamb. And in the midst of the street thereof, and on both sides of the river, was the tree of life, bearing 12 fruits, yielding its fruits every month. And the leaves of the trees were for the healing of the nations. But what I want you to get there is that this image of the throne seated above the waters is, it's there in the Psalms, and it's there in Revelation. So it's another of those ways in which the Old Testament and the New Testament were bound together in the same imaginative world. That image of the throne seated above the waters, seated above these raging waters, raging seas, is what Tolkien evokes for me in this moment in the Ainulindale. And it's what causes that raging of the seas, what causes that turbulence in the waters. Well, it's Melkor's discord, right? But note what Iluvatar does with that discord, right? He sets it. He sends a new theme into the storm, right? I'm gonna storm. It's always significant, and the delight should be in the unraveling of the patterns and the trust in the Lord. But okay, so Iluvatar sets up this new theme amid the storm, like and yet unlike to the former theme, and it gathers power. But the discord of Melkor rises in uproar and contends with it, and there's a war of sound, more violent than before, until many of the Ainur dismayed and sing no longer, and Melkor has the mastery. So it seems like in the midst of this raging storm of noise and waters, the rushing, the raging storm, dark waters making war in this endless wrath, and the Ainur are dismayed, right? But Iluvatar rises again, and the third theme, he propounds a third theme amidst the confusion, unlike the others. And now, this one is different, soft and sweet at first, but taking on a great power and profundity. And then for a time, it seems like there's this tension between the discord and the sweetness of the themes that Iluvatar has proposed, but particularly this third one. The one theme was deep and wide and beautiful, but slow and blended with an immeasurable sorrow, from which its beauty chiefly came. The other now achieved a unity of its own, but it was loud and vain and endlessly repeated, and had little harmony, but rather a clamorous unison, as of many trumpets braying upon a few notes, and it essayed to drown the other music by the violence of its voice, but it seemed that its most triumphant notes were taken by the other and woven into its own solemn patterns. So there's this musical strife that we're imagining, clashing and clashing around Iluvatar's throne, but he's not bothered by it, right? It's like he stands, propounds a second theme, propounds a third theme, which Melkor's trumpets and blaring and vain, clamorous union that just brays but on a few notes, right? It's just trying to be as loud as possible, blast, 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 but it blends with this gentle and sweet melody, theme that is deep and wide and beautiful and blended with an immeasurable sorrow, from which its beauty chiefly came. Now, this is Tolkien he's trying to show us, one, where beauty comes from, which is interesting that it comes not just from the harmony that all the Ainur have initially in singing with each other, right? It's like beauty is not, the greatest beauty comes not from that simply following theme that Iluvatar proposed, but in the striving of these subsequent themes with the discord that Melkor has tried to create off on his own, right? And that the third theme is deep and wide and beautiful, but slow and blended with an immeasurable sorrow, from which its beauty chiefly came. What on earth could Tolkien be talking about here, right? And I've set you up saying Melkor is obviously a satanic figure. He's some kind of Luciferian character, in that he is the mightiest of the Ainur, given the greatest gifts of power and knowledge at the outset, and yet and then tries to overcome in his impatience what Iluvatar has set up. And yet Iluvatar, by taking the discord that Melkor sort of forces into the music, makes the music even more beautiful. Oh, this is just a little topical, right? Always that you are, the sort of too long didn't read version is because like the struggles that we have in life are in fact what gives us the greatest beauty in our striving with the sorrow. And what Tolkien is going to do, obviously, in The Lord of the Rings, is give you a story in which the immeasurable sorrow gives forth beauty, and that of course comes from when I read that one, I think of the passage in the Field of Cormallen, when the hobbits get to hear sung, right? That matters a lot. When the hobbits get to hear sung the story of their own adventure, right? It's going to be, the minstrel comes forth and he says, "I will sing to you of Frodo the Nine Fingers and the Ring of Doom." And when Sam heard that, he laughed aloud for sheer delight, and he stood up and cried, "Oh, great glory and splendor, and all my wishes have come true." And then he wept. And all the host laughed and wept. This is this beauty coming from sorrow, the laughter and the joy, the laughter and the tears. And in the midst of their merriment and tears, the clear voice of the minstrel rose like silver and gold, and all men were hushed. And he sang to them, now in the elven tongue, now in the speech of the West, until their hearts, wounded with sweet words, overflowed. and their joy was like swords. And they passed in thought out to regions where pain and delight flow together, and tears are the very wine of blessedness. Beginning and end, right? That the Ainulindale is always in Tolkien's head when he's writing The Lord of the Rings. So we're saying if that passage there where the tears are the very wine of blessedness evokes the very music of creation, the harm, if it evokes the very music of creation, that moment when you're telling that story of Frodo and the Nine-Fingered and the Ring of Doom, you are touching the problem of creation, and that is the kind of harmony, resonance that Tolkien is actually trying to show you working throughout his stories. But of course, therefore, we should also be expecting it to work throughout his model, throughout the scriptures. Well, there's another place, and you probably already figured this out from my title, so there's another place in the Old Testament where Satan gets a role. It's in fact, I think in Genesis it's the serpent, right? So whether we're named, the place where Satan is named, of course, the most prominent place where Satan is named is in the book of Job. And we read from the book of Job last time about creation. We read about how the Lord answered Job out of a whirlwind and said, "Who is this that rappeth of sentences and unskilled words? Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if thou hast understanding. Who hath laid the measures thereof, if thou knowest? Who hath stretched the line upon it?" We talked of the measurement and the music and the measuring and the mathematics that is so important in this creation. Upon what are its bases grounded, or who laid the cornerstone thereof? When the morning stars praised me together, and all the sons of God made a joyful melody. And the next verse, interesting. Who shut up the sea with doors when it broke forth as issuing out of the womb, when I made a cloud, the garment thereof, and wrapped it in the midst as in swaddling bands. And I set my bounds around it and made it bars and doors. That my suggestion to you in the previous episode was that Tolkien's getting this image of the Ainur at creation as the morning stars singing, because it's back there in the back of this mythology that has jubilees describing the creation of all the spirits of the air and remind you, we went through a lot in the last episode, but this one, the angels of the spirit of fire and of the winds, of the clouds and darkness and snow and hail and frost, thunder and lightning, and the spirits of winter, cold, and the seasons and so forth. That in Job we have a sort of touching, again, a touching upon this story that the original audience for the Old Testament seems to have known, right? Or obviously the Old Testament is a collection of books, and the authors of the Old Testament seem to be drawing on a consistent story world. A lot of biblical scholarship on that one. And in Job, we're pointing to that story of creation where it happens in the midst of the morning stars praised me together, and all the sons of God made a joyful melody. Well, why is Job in the situation to be having God come and chastise him for not remembering who made everything? It is, of course, because Job is letting God is letting Satan test Job, and that we have that at the beginning of the book, that Job is blessed with children and possessions, and feasting and so forth, and then the sons of God, and again, it's this phrasing, the sons of God, just as we have in the Genesis, the sons of God go into the daughters of men and have giants with them. Here in the book of Job, we have, now on a certain day when the sons of God came to stand before the Lord, Satan was also present among them. The adversary, the enemy, Satan, right? Satan is there before the throne of God, and this is, the timing on it's well after creation, because you have human beings, and Job is there living his life, which always kind of puzzled me. It's like, so Satan somehow still has access to the throne of God? Okay, fine. He's not, stuck down there in pandemonium like Milton imagined him, but somehow he's there. And the Lord said to him, to Satan, "Whence comest thou?" And Satan answered and said, "I have gone round about the earth and walked through it." And the Lord said to him, to Satan, "Hast thou considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a simple and upright man, and fearing God, and avoiding evil?" And Satan answering said, "Doth Job fear God in vain? Hast thou not made a fence for him in his house, and all his substance round about, blessed the works of his hands, and his possession hath increased the earth? But stretch forth thy hand a little, and touch all that he hath, and see if he blesseth thee not to thy face." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, all that he hath is in thy hand, only put not forth thy hand upon his person." And Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord. So the Lord asked Satan, who apparently has been walking around on earth, "Don't you know Job?" And Satan says, "Yes, but you've given him all that good stuff. You've blessed him with his possessions and his house and his family. I bet he's only faithful to you because of all that stuff," right? And the point of the story in Job is that he loses everything except not his wife, right? But he loses his Satan strikes Job. He makes him sick. He takes all his children. He takes all his possessions, and Job is left there, sitting on a dung heap, scratching at his sores with a potsherd. His friends try to convince him to give up faith in God. Even his wife comes and tries to convince him to give up his faith in God, and he doesn't. And it's at the end of all of that testing of Job's faith that we get God, the Lord, answering Job out of the whirlwind, retelling the exercise of the story of the creation, which gives us this. Therefore, here's Satan as the son of God in the same story in which we also have the sons of God making joyful melody before at the well, it doesn't say throne. Morning stars praise me together, and the sons of God made a joyful melody. Maybe Tolkien read this book of Job too, and that he's playing with the theological questions that the book of Job obviously raises. It's like, if you lose all of your things, are you still going to praise God? Are you still going to be able to praise God as a creator if all of the good stuff that you have, all of the worldly possessions, even to the extent of your children, are taken from you? Who is it? And that, it never seems to me God's like God. I always expect, think you think God should show up and basically say, good job, Job. You stuck with it, and you never spoke against me, and hooray. But instead, he comes out of the whirlwind and sort of it always feels like he's taunting Job. But the details with which he's explaining what it means to have been there at creation, to be the one as creator, are in fact more elaborate than what we get in the story of Genesis of the creation, if you want to know the way in which God's working plays out. And so we have here, the listing of all of the creatures that he makes, and the gates of death, and so forth. And then he gets, and this is always, sort of massively interesting, to the descriptions of his two greatest creatures, adversaries. What are they? Right? The monsters, Behemoth and Leviathan. And that we have Behemoth described as this magnificent creature, listed among all of the other creatures that God makes. Saying, behold the behemoth whom I made with thee, he eateth grass like an ox, his strength in his loins, and his force in the navel of his belly. He's very, very strong, right? Behold, he will come. So here's the land beast. And then there's the sea beast, the Leviathan, right? This is basically the great sea monster, which is also a fire-breathing dragon. Now, the sort of, if you want to have the image of Saint Michael fighting the dragon, the Saint Michael fighting Satan at the end in Revelation, which we have in Revelation 12. Saying Genesis is Revelation and Revelation is Genesis. Maybe that's the lesson for today. Genesis is Revelation and Revelation is Genesis. That in Revelation we have a great battle in heaven. Michael and his angels fought with the dragon, and the dragon fought his angels. And they prevailed not, neither was their place any more in heaven. And that great dragon was cast out, that old serpent, who's called the devil and Satan, who seduceth the whole world. And he was cast unto the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. Like I said, the time frame in this, I realize, is suddenly confusing to me, because it's apparently after there's a temple and the ark shows up and a great sign appears in heaven and the woman clothed with the sun appears and gives birth to the child. And so that's usually taken to be a sign of the world to come. And yet it's actually also the description of what happens in Michael's fighting with Satan and when he's cast down with his angels. So which is it? And the dragon is also the dragon who's Satan is cast on the earth, right? Well, the Leviathan is also here described in Job, and it's interesting because he's this magnificent sea monster, which is that image that you're going to get of back with Melkor. And I think Melkor is also going to become Morgoth and make dragons, right? So there's this folding in of all of this satanic imagery into Melkor, which I'm wanting to sort of get on stage and everything. So we're thinking about exactly what kind of Einar is he, what kind of fallen angel he is, what is his sin, what kinds of what role does he play in the story, but why is his discord necessary? And it seems with the Leviathan that he is also necessary as the adversary, right? And what the Lord asked Job, canst thou draw out the Leviathan with a hook, or canst thou tie his tongue with a cord? Canst thou put a ring in his nose, or bore through his jaw with a buckle? Will he make many supplications to thee, or speak soft words to thee? Just talking dragons. Will he make a covenant with thee, and wilt thou take him to be a servant forever? Shalt thou play with him as with a bird, or tie him up for thy handmaids? Shall friends cut him in pieces? Shall merchants divide him? Behold, his hope shall fail him, and in the sight of all he shall be cast down. So that seems to describe him as a dragon like the one that we have in Revelation. But he also seems to have other characteristics. Who can discover the face of his garment, or who can go into the midst of his mouth? Who can open the doors of his face? His teeth are terrible round about. His body is like molten shields, shut up with scales, pressing upon one another. One is joined to another, and not so much as any air can come between them. They stick to one another, and they hold one another fast, and shall not be separated. His sneezing is like the shining of fire, and his eyelids like and his eyes like the eyelids of the morning. Out of his mouth go forth lamps, like torches of lighted fire. He's a fire-breathing dragon, right? The Leviathan. If you wonder, it's like where are the dragons, right? We've had I did an episode ages ago on the dragons, right? Here is the Leviathan, and Job is the great fire-breathing dragon. Out of his nostrils goes smoke, like that of a pot heated and boiling. His breath kindleth coals, and a flame cometh forth out of his mouth. In his neck strength shall dwell, and what goeth before his face. The members of his flesh cleave to one another. He shall send lightnings against him, and they shall not be carried to another place. His heart shall be as hard as a stone, and as firm as a smith's anvil. He shall raise up, when he shall raise him up, the angels shall fear, and being affrighted shall purify themselves. When a short sword shall lay at him, it shall not be able to hold, nor a spear, nor a breastplate, for he shall esteem iron as straw, and brass as rotten woods. The beams of the sun shall be under him, and he shall strew gold under him like mire. He shall make the deep sea to boil like a pot, and shall make it as when ointments boil. A path shall shine after him. He shall esteem the deep as growing old. There is no power upon earth that can be compared with him, who was made to fear no one. He beholdeth every high thing. He is king over all the children of pride. Now, that, it's like, is the... Again, with Melkor and Lucifer, Satan, the dragon, Leviathan, it's complicated to figure out exactly whether or not they're the good guys or the bad guys. I mean, they are the bad guys because of the adversaries, but there's the way in which they are necessary to the beauty of creation, and that is what Melkor is affecting. Right now, if we go on with the story in the Anulindale, and we're going to be doing several episodes on this because creation is really significant, that what Iluvatar is able to do is take the discord that Melkor introduces into the music, and make something even more beautiful. To understand that, we are going to need to get into the identity of the other Ainur, and to understand the significance of the different elements that creation involves. So I'm going to leave that to the next to our next episode. This one I wanted to get, well, one, I wanted to mark the storm and to re-emphasize the fact that when Tolkien is playing with his mythology at every level of incredible detail, it really helps if you know the backstory that he's playing off of, and the way in which he, with his own backstory to his main narrative. I mean, say the I don't know that the Lord of the Rings is like the Old Testament. It's the the Silmarillion is more like the Old Testament story, in that our first theme is going to be the elves, right, and our second theme is going to be the hobbits and the men, and it's the hobbits and the men that come in to their own more in the Lord of the Rings, but the men also have a role in the Silmarillion. That absolutely at every point Tolkien is doing he's doing something richer and much more complicated than simply creating an alternative creation. He is, what I think he is trying to do is, in his story world, provide answers to some of the questions that the Old Testament and the New Testament raise about what kind of mythology we inhabit, in fact, as Christians. And in this this beginning moment of creation, after we've measured everything and made everything harmonious and very beautiful, and we're recognizing that the world is made to this magnificent measure and beauty and harmony, and the singing that goes on in the temple is to celebrate that creation. Here comes, I mean, literally on the second page of this story, discord immediately, instantaneously. And that in the Christian tradition, we know it as something that's always there with us, that somehow Satan has a role in this story, that, you know, he's allowed by God, by the Lord, to tempt Job into loss of faith, and yet he can't. And yet in his description of his prowess, or that doesn't seem really like the right word for God, in the description of his majesty as creator to Job, he acknowledges the creation of these monsters, particularly the Leviathan. Somehow all of that is part of the beauty, that the sorrow that the temptations and the storm and the discord bring is in fact also a part of the majesty of the music. And yet there's sin, and yet there's fallenness, and yet there's sorrow. And that is the great mystery that we are about to encounter. Then Iluvatar spoke, and he said, "Mighty are the Ainur, and mightiest among them is Melkor, that he may know in all the Ainur that I am Iluvatar. Those things that ye have sung, I will show them forth, that ye may see what ye have done. And thou, Melkor, shalt see that no theme may be played that hath not its uttermost source in me. Nor can any alter the music in my despite. For he that attempteth this shall prove but mine instrument in the devising of things more wonderful, which he himself hath not imagined." Then the Ainur were afraid, and they did not yet comprehend the words that were said to them. And Melkor was filled with shame, of which came secret anger. But Iluvatar rose in splendor, and he went forth from the fair regions that he made for the Ainur, and the Ainur followed him. To be continued.